Good to see you, boys.
See ya. Yeah, and I guess last week's topic of vitamin D lended itself to a couple of times it popped up about inflammation and how vitamin D would reduce inflammation. So I think it was a natural progression to talk about inflammation and various different types and things like that. So today's discussion, we're gonna talk about sort of systemic inflammation, and there's probably two different types. So systemic inflammation or chronic inflammation is caused by long-term adverse, probably lifestyle practices, and then we have acute inflammation, which is the body's reaction to an injury. For example, you've fallen over, you've rolled your ankle. Acute inflammation, the body's response is your ankle blows up, things come in to kind of clear out that inflammation and get it back to homeostasis or back to normal. So the one we're going to focus on today is chronic inflammation or systemic inflammation caused by those long-term adverse lifestyle practices, bad diet, smoking, excessive alcohol, but we'll touch on all of those. I guess for the ancestral man, we talked about it really early on, and that gene expression. So our bodies have the genes there to be sort of the perfect human specimen, and if we're not expressing those genes or we're not allowing those genes to flourish, and we talked about sort of the 8 things we could do in our President of the World podcast, those things are sort of good for optimal health. If we're not doing those things, that results in undesirable gene expression and long-term systemic inflammation.
And mate, before people listening to this go, inflammation, I'm just going to skip this one, not really interested. Okay, it's not a most exciting, sexy subject, but everyone is suffering some form of inflammation, and you probably don't even know it. It is a common chronic, for want of a better word, illness in society. Everyone's got some sort of form of inflammation, either caused by a diet, which we'll get into, and so on. But I just read this interesting fact that the highest selling pharmaceutical drug in the world over the last few years is a product called Humira, Humira, which is an anti-inflammatory drug, most paid for drug in the world. Okay, it's especially used for autoimmune conditions like arthritis, Crohn's disease, and so on. So that just gives you an example, and maybe a COVID vaccine might have taken that over in the last couple of years. But over a number of years, that has been the world's most highest selling pharmaceutical drug for inflammation.
Yeah, and I would dare say that prednisone or prednisolone, depending on what part of the world you come from, is right up there as well in terms of the amount of people taking it, which is used for those chronic sort of inflammatory.
Is that a steroid?
It is. It is a steroid. But
well, you look at Nurofen, all of those ones, they're anti-inflammatory drugs. Voltaren.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah,
pumping ourselves because we're so full of inflammation.
Yeah, it's one of those ones. You hear about inflammation kicked around all the time, don't you? But no one really knows exactly what it is and how it affects us. And I think it's worthwhile talking about this today because it's really important for long-term health. Yeah. And the last thing we want is to be living in a state of chronic inflammation because it's going to affect our quality of life. It's going to affect our longevity. It's going to affect our overall health at a cellular level. And it's not a nice way to live. Like when you look at the host of inflammatory diseases, think of anything that finishes in the word itis. Yep. It's an inflammatory thing. Yeah. Arthritis, bursitis, any itis, inflammation. Yep. And it's prevalent. It's so prevalent in our society today. Well, it's something that's worth controlling.
Yeah. A lot of experts are saying that systemic inflammation or chronic inflammation is the root cause of all disease.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, and to your point, Smitty, I would totally agree that this is probably one of the most important health topics to be discussed and known out of anything. It's such a massive effect on every other thing that in our body is inflammation, and I think it's well worth knowing about and having a look into it.
It's sort of like Health 101. This is like almost your really foundational health advice, which is that we want to have, because we need inflammation, right? Like Jonesy spoke about, we have acute inflammation, we have chronic inflammation. If we didn't have acute inflammation, then every time you cut yourself, rolled your ankle, we wouldn't heal. So
right.
like we need that inflammatory pathway to signal our body to heal injury. But what we don't want is that chronic inflammatory sort of state where we just have high levels of sort of inflammatory markers in our body all the time. It's a terrible way to live.
Yeah.
So,
And you've got inflammation. Often the symptoms are pain, heat, redness, swelling, a loss of function, and that's quite easy to measure for ailments outside of the body. But those symptoms also apply internally as well. So, internal swelling, internal heat, internal pain, they are symptoms of some sort of inflammation within your body. All right, not just on the superficial aspect of it, like you're rolling your ankle, you can see the effect of inflammation. Inside, you can't generally see it, and it's your body will eventually, the function of a body somewhere will deteriorate in some aspect as a result of that inflammation.
And it will present in various
various
different ways, yeah. Like Smithy was talking about there, the ancestral man, we need inflammation, and our immune system response to inflammation is critical to our health, right? But it's not designed for chronic stresses. It's designed for those type of stresses we're talking about there. A twisted ankle, to recover from a cut, it's designed for that. It's not designed to be chronically elevated with stress levels. We're not used to dealing with that, and that stimulus, when it's chronic, that's when it becomes harmful. And I think one of the biggest ones, we have touched on it before, but I don't know where we wanted to go with this, but I think one of the biggest ones is diet. So a diet high in grains, vegetable oils, and chemically altered ingredients, especially the fats, and that have minimal nutritional value, are causing oxidative stress and damage the body big time. So if we want to go back and we want to link it to our vitamin D from our last episode, I'm going to give you another study. So this was done in 1987, so it's going back a while. It's called Melanoma and Dietary Lipids. You can look it up by Mackey et al. Bringing back my Bachelor of Science degree here using the references.
Ooh.
Yep.
Good man.
So this one talked about inflammation and an increase in inflammation and an increase in PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids, that we get from our various vegetable oils, fats, margarines, etc. A higher level of PUFA in the body increases the risk of melanoma. So often people talk about, some of the experts, and I know you can look them up, various bits and pieces, but having excess vegetable oil or PUFAs in your system causes you to get sunburnt more easily and increases the risk, based on that study, of melanoma.
Wow.
Yeah. So we have talked about that, and reducing or getting rid of, completely eliminating vegetable oils.
Yes.
Is a good start for that standard Australian or American diet. SAD, that's high in processed food. We talk about it all the time. Getting back to nature, having food close to its natural state as it would have been: meat, eggs, fruit, fish, vegetables, a few nuts and seeds, those kind of things, and that have been minimally processed.
Yeah, you're spot on, CJ. I think it's very clear now that omega-6 in balance with omega-3 is one of the main culprits for increased inflammation. And we see so much of it now because of our processed food diet. Like, if you eat food, like we do require omega-6, but if you eat food, then you'll get enough omega-6. There's no reason to add it to food or supplement it or get it in the form of seed oils. And if we can reduce that as much as possible, I think that's going to be one really good way to reduce that aspect of our sort of inflammatory burden. Because if we look at when we have high lipid levels in our bloodstream, if we combine that with high inflammation, then that's when we get the uptake of those sort of atherosclerotic plaques, like the plaque in your arteries is in the presence of inflammation. So it's really important for us to reduce inflammation from all angles. And I think it's really clear now, all the sort of good functional doctors, all the people that are big in the wellness world, longevity, omega-6 fatty acids, vegetable oils, seed oils are probably the most important thing to control and one of the worst things you can consume. So your canola oils, your sunflower oils, your soy oils. Very, very bad.
So one of the things that ratio, you were talking about the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we want to reduce that. And in the modern, is it about 3 to 1? Did you?
Yeah, look, I don't have the ratio off the top of my head.
I think it's 3 or 4 to 1. So you want sort of.
I mean, some of the really sort of wellness people are talking about, like, you want to get right up to like 8 to 1. You don't want it to be
too low.
1 to 1, for example.
Yeah.
And the important thing to remember is if you have a high intake of omega-6 in your diet, you can't correct that ratio by just taking more omega-3. You need to reduce your omega-6.
Yes.
So it's not a seesaw where you go, oh, well, I've had 2,000 milligrams of omega-6 fatty acids, so I'm going to equal that out with 10,000 milligrams of omega-3. It doesn't work like that. You have to reduce your dietary intake of omega-6.
And a lot of foods that include omega-6, donuts, processed biscuits, those kind of things, very high in omega-6s. Yeah. So
and foods that the average punter out there can increase their intake of for omega-3s would be what, your avocados,
fish,
oily
eggs.
fish is really good. Yeah. Eggs. Yep. Nuts.
Yeah.
So we want to reduce. We're kind of putting a sciencey little spin on it, but we want to reduce the bad processed foods and increase the good natural foods, and ultimately you will get omega-3. I know they talk about grass-fed fat profile of grass-fed, grass-finished beef is high in omega-3. Granted, it's not quite at the level of fish, but, we've always been told, we're all around the same age as young fellas, cut that fat off. What are you doing? Don't eat that. It's not good for you. But, there are some good nutrient benefits from eating good, great grass-finished beef. The omega-3 content of the fat is high. Yeah. So I guess what I was getting at with that omega-6 thing is a high insulin producing diet, or that carb cycle that we've talked about, where we have a meal high in carbohydrates, the insulin comes in to the blood to clear out the excess glucose. It does that. It stores the excess calories or the excess glucose as fat. And that cycle takes about sort of 3 hours. And after that 3 hours, you're hungry again. You haven't eaten enough protein or fat to be satiated, to reduce the hormones that tell you you're hungry or you're full, satiated. And that sort of excess storage, or the storage of the omega-6 is resulting in excess fluid in the cells and bloating and being puffy. So if we can reduce the inflammation, it's going to increase our weight loss, and we're going to, get rid of some of that bloat and the puffy skin and less fluid retention. So
just while you're on with the glucose, mate, I read somewhere that increased glucose in the blood actually damages. There's this thin cell layer in your arteries, and so the extra glucose in the blood damages that thin cell layer, and the body heals it by creating a clot.
Yes.
And so then from that clot, inflammation is caused around that area, and then before you know it, that clot could break off and cause other problems. But therein lies just one little scenario of inflammation caused by too much glucose in the blood system.
Well, that's the kind of newish theory on heart disease, isn't it? We talked about it before with cholesterol, and cholesterol often shows up in that little inflammation and damage and in the artery, and people think, oh, well, cholesterol's there, it must be the reason it's clogging the arteries. But it's possibly the inflammation that's doing that, and the things that are coming in. So the macrophages come in to clear out that that damage, and they produce a scar. So scarring tissue comes in the artery, and the inflammation is probably from something else, and the cholesterol is coming in to help clean that up.
Yeah.
So possible cause of heart disease is the systemic inflammation in the body, rather than having excess amounts of cholesterol. The cholesterol is there to help clear the inflammation out, rather than it being the cause of the inflammation. So that's another interesting hypothesis on heart disease, it being more of an inflammatory disorder rather than it being high levels of cholesterol.
I think that's a really interesting point. which is worth us sort of exploring a little bit more there, boys, which is that the body, and this is something we've all discussed regularly, is an amazing mechanism. It's the most intelligent and incredible computer that we will ever get to be involved with. And it is always communicating innately with us in order to return us to that position of balance and homeostasis. And I think that a lot of these signs and signals are the body's way of communicating with us innately to let us know that things aren't in the position that they should be in, and I love the play on words with words like disease, like disease is just dis-ease in the body. It's not in a position of harmony. It's communicating with you as a vessel to let you know that it isn't where it needs to be. And I think that inflammation is, or chronic inflammation rather, is potentially a position of health that's been ignored repeatedly. So, the body just doesn't develop chronic inflammation as a starting point. If we look at, the example of, someone who might have diarrhea or something like that, a gastrointestinal issue, might start out with, they have a poor response to food, and that poor response to food, a particular food, causes them to have a little bit of diarrhea. Well, if that response to that food choice goes ignored, it may evolve into, that constant irritation of the bowel could develop into an irritable bowel style response. And then if you continue to ignore it, the inflammation continues to increase. You may develop some acid reflux, and so on it goes. But I think that the amazing thing here is that the body is always communicating with us. Its innate design is to return us back to health, and we just have to be able to listen to it.
That's a good point, mate.
Yeah.
I mean, and we talked about mental health a few episodes back, and we haven't even really touched on cortisol with regards to inflammation. And Jonesy, you're probably well read up on that. I mean, cortisol is a hormone. It's an inflammatory or a main inflammatory sort of related hormone.
Well, I'll stop you there.
Stressor.
Cortisol is the most potent anti-inflammatory hormone that we have in our body, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So cortisol is thought of as a stress hormone in a chronic state, but it actually has anti-inflammatory properties.
Right.
In the correct balance. So,
okay.
So cortisol sort of involved with our regulation of sleep and wakefulness and our sort of cycles and things like that. But
cortisol is caused by too much cortisol due to chronic stress. So what I read was, and I was trying to get my head around this, is when you're in a constant stage of chronic stress, so you're always stressed out, your body produces a lot of cortisol. But it's like insulin. So when there's too much, the cortisol receptors become resistant to recognizing that cortisol in the blood.
Spot on.
So when it's chronic, it's bad.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. That's what I was sort of getting at.
So once again, all about balance.
Yeah. So a lack of cortisol due to ongoing stress can be a cause of inflammation.
Mm. Yeah, you lose all those beneficial properties of correctly cycling your cortisol.
We say like our war veterans or our soldiers over at war, they're in a scenario where they aren't able to come off that spike in cortisol. If they're in a combat style situation and they're forced to be super vigilant for, not the 2 or 3 hours like we're supposed to as the ancestral man, but they may have to be in high levels of cortisol for months.
Yeah, I mean, even people that just have chronic stress from their everyday lifestyle. So whether you're a busy executive or you're a stressed out parent, and a lot of it comes into sleep deprivation as well. So if you're chronically sleep deprived, then you're going to get a high level of those stress hormones, and then you're going to get that sort of detrimental effect of having high cortisol levels, which we really want to avoid. And I think Roo, was it you talking about meditation in part of our President of the World series? Mm-hmm. Obviously, fantastic way to reduce cortisol levels.
Yeah. And so just going back to Mickey's point about the soldiers, I mean, they might be able to have more controlled cortisol production, because they're sort of they are in a longer period of a stressful environment, but
so well trained to do it.
Yes, but cortisol is also responsible for the bodily functions with the fight or flight mechanism. Yeah, so a soldier would probably produce cortisol at those higher levels when they are in a moment of fight or flight or in a stressful situation. If they were in a fight or flight situation ongoing, then yes, they would find it problems. But you'd probably find that an everyday person suffering just the stresses of everyday life, like you said, is probably more prone to that cortisol issue than maybe a soldier at war. I don't know.
Yeah.
A soldier at war's stressors might go up and down quite regularly, whereas a person on a constant high level of stress is going to suffer that cortisol issue and therefore inflammation more so.
Yeah, super important.
Mm.
Yeah. And just very briefly, Roo, getting back to what you were talking about with glucose. Glucose is, like you said, incredibly inflammatory on your vessel walls. And it takes me back to when I was a paramedic, we used to infuse glucose or dextrose, different form of sugar, into people's veins when they'd had a period of hypoglycemia. So diabetic patients, if they were unconscious and we had a lot of trouble getting their blood sugar levels restored, then we used to infuse glucose or dextrose. But it's incredibly inflammatory, and we used to have to be very, very careful that we were in the vein before we infused it and that we infused it at the right ratio. Otherwise, you could cause a hell of a lot of damage by doing it incorrectly. That's how inflammatory glucose is.
Wow.
And so for all those people out there who, maybe have diabetes and think it's not a big deal, it's a huge deal.
Yeah.
If your vessels are getting that constant high level of glucose all the time, causing that inflammatory damage and all the microclotting and stuff that goes on with it and the reduced blood flow, it's really, really bad. So glucose is incredibly bad for your vessel walls and your inflammation levels.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up. So I wanted to sort of go back to. I wanted to talk about various different things that cause systemic inflammation. So we talked about diet. We could probably continue talking about that, but we have talked about it before. We're talking about having increased stress, elevated cortisol all the time. So we were talking about sort of highly strung corporate type, working all the time, 60, 70 hours a week. It could be new parents not getting enough sleep, etc., etc. One that I'm not sure a lot of people talk about in having systemic inflammation is chronic exercise. So I know Mickey Mack, being a former Ironman, high-level Ironman triathlete, and I've done several marathons. And going back to my sports science days, I don't know, a couple of guys at Volek and Finney. I don't know, did you come across them during your studies? Anyway, so Volek and Finney are pretty big in the sports science world. I remember them from 25 years ago when I did my degree, but they've got a couple of really good books, and one's called The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, and the other one's called The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance. And they talk about the general gist is, a low carbohydrate diet produces less insulin, less glucose, and therefore is a anti-inflammatory diet.
Yep.
And their performance one is sort of chronic exercise is bad. So I don't know. I hope I'm not offending Mick with his long distance running, but those exercises that we're doing day in, day out, and I would say that training for an Ironman triathlete would be one of these chronic exercises that is promoting systemic inflammation. So, we did talk about those types of exercises that we can do: sprint a little bit, lift heavy things, and go for a longer run or walk, and make sure we're getting adequate recovery and rest. And so rest, we could talk about sleep being probably one of the biggest things to help reduce systemic inflammation. But one of the things I think that is big in the world currently is, we're doing all these things where we're working 9 to 5, then we're going out in the morning, we're doing a 10K run, and we're doing that day after day. And that stuff that's sort of chronic exercise and chronic stress is another reason why too frequently, too often and we're not letting our bodies recover is another one. I don't know how everyone feels about that or whether it was something that people had thought about, but definitely, short bouts of exercise for an hour or so a day, maybe having a day off, 4 to 5 times a week, I think is ideal. Doing something every day, chronically 2 or 3 hours is not ideal, and that's causing systemic inflammation in the body.
Jonesy, this is one that that I've actually, since I've sort of stopped racing so seriously, I've explored a little bit more closely, and it came about more from necessity.
Yeah. Did you feel way better when you stopped racing? I know when I stopped running, and now I don't really do much more than a 5 or 10K run, but when I was doing the big ones, I felt terrible.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm back up running probably 70, 75 Ks a week, but I'm only running now. Whereas before, when I was training for Ironman, I was training in peak training around 25 hours a week. And, a long bike day for me could have been 6 or 7 hours. And I think I realised...
That's getting chronic, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I realised the impact on my body the last time I headed over to the Worlds in Hawaii. And about 8 weeks out, I got a virus, and it was heading into the World Championships. I wasn't afraid of taking a day or two off to recover, but a few days turned into a week, turned into a couple of weeks, and as a high performing athlete, you start to get a bit of a panic on, because you're like, well, I'm 6 weeks out now, taper's 2 weeks, I've got 4 weeks left, and I actually ended up in hospital, and I there was some discussion with my wife and my mum and dad about whether I should even be going. And in the end, I, convinced them I'd be fine, got over there, and long story short, body completely shut down on me. And I actually lost 9 kilos on the day. And I got to a point where my body started to reject any electrolytes. And in a race that goes for, 8 to 9.5 hours, you need to be able to consume electrolytes in order to keep your body going in 90% humidity and, 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. So I was unable to take any nutrition on board after pretty much 2 hours into the race. It took me a year and a half when I got back to be able to stomach electrolytes after that.
Jeez.
Wow. And it wasn't something I considered in depth. For me, trying to get back to racing, and it was just a part of a process. And, I worked with a number of different sport doctors. But now, some 5 or 6 years down the line, being semi-removed from the sport, I am looking at these impacts on my body, and I'm inclined to agree. I think it would be laughing in the face of common sense to say that these endurance type sports, Ironmans, long endurance running, cycling, ultramarathon, whatever, that they're good for the body. And I've asked myself, I've done a lot of journaling on this. Well, why did I do it? And I think, what it is? For me, it's the mental part of it. It was more beneficial to me to be going out and tackling those challenges mentally and having the experience. I gave that more weight than what I did the negatives on the impacts of the body. And I think a lot of people would fit in that category as well.
You love the challenge, mate.
Yeah, it was the challenge. And also, we've all got our own different things that we love to do that keeps us mentally ticking along. For me, running has always been that from the time I was a young kid. And, a 20-minute run or some sprints down the oval just doesn't do it for me as much as if I go run for 90 minutes. And so, it is this balance, isn't it, of when does it become too much and we're still, achieving and doing things that, are fulfilling us.
But rest and recovery, right? So if you're doing 90 minutes, you're probably not doing that 4, 5, 6 days in a row anymore. And I I understand the lure of, you know, the Ironman and the marathon. It's a bit of a challenge. It's completing something. I just think once you start doing it day in, day out for years on end is when it becomes an issue.
And I guess those serious competitors, though, on their professionalism, have other things in place to counteract the negative or the chronic effects of that exercise regime. So they are more strict on their sleep routines, their nutrition, any supplementation, their rest, the recovery. That's a whole separate serious protocol that they apply to that whole training regime.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So I was going to ask you, Mickey, and I'll get back to that, Roo, but did you often find that you were often sick when you were exercising that way?
I certainly always felt I was on the threshold of something, whether it was injury or whether it was, I mean, I explained this to my wife, when she would ask me why do you do it? And there's something about being as fit as what I was at that time and the feeling of sort of, you just felt superhuman. You felt like you could do anything. But no, the balance of that was you always felt like, you could get sick or there was an injury just around the corner. Interestingly, just sort of touching on what Roo said then is a lot of the sort of professionals from the late 80s, early 90s, one of the, Greg Welsh, one of the most celebrated endurance triathletes in Australian history, he's actually developed a heart arrhythmia now. So there's an example of sort of this potentially this chronic stress or chronic inflammation over a number of years on his heart, which is now causing this irregularity, and it's actually something that's becoming very common in a lot of these athletes in this sport. So
wow.
A lot of these things won't actually show up until later on.
It's interesting you mentioned those endurance athletes from the 80s because one of the godfathers, I guess, of fat for fuel, using your fats or dietary fats and your fat storage, was a guy called Mark Allen. Do you know much about him, Mickey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so he had this sort of chronic exercise and always using the gels and the glucose and carbohydrates to fuel his performance, and then sort of switched it on his head and got some coaching about using fat and went to a more of a high fat, low carb diet, and he dominated till into his 30s and 40s, I would have thought.
Yeah, he did. He was, well, he's one of the gods of the island over there, and he had an incredibly successful career. I think that this is the real negotiation point and the interesting part in this, and something you and I have spoken about, Jonesy, is that fat adaptation and racing on fat, and why are more people not doing it? And I don't know if it's because it hasn't been fully explored, but if we looked at the ratios or the percentages of athletes still competing on carbohydrates and sugars comparatively to fats, I think it would still be heavily weighted the other way. Most of the athletes that I'm still connecting with, they're still utilizing a lot of the gels and all of these sorts of things. But I think the interesting assessment point will come, like we're sort of indicating, with these long-term chronic stresses down the track. What is his ability to live his life as a 55, 60, 65, 70-year-old? What's his inflammation like? What are his knees like? What are his ankles like comparatively to how these other people have fueled their bodies? I think it'll be a really interesting point of assessment.
So going back to that race, mate, did you win it?
Not even close.
Wrong answer.
Weak bastard.
So what other things are we talking about that are causing systemic inflammation, do you think?
Well, what about allergies? Allergies is a big cause of inflammation, and allergies sort of get things that cause allergies get demonized as the problem of inflammation, whereas in fact it's just our body's reaction to that food or whatever, or even environmental factor. It's just our body responding to it. And there's a few things that the average punter could take away if they are suffering inflammation with regards to their diet. I mean, we're all pretty well versed on dairy and gluten allergies, but often, so people having that casein, sort of, what do you call it?
Intolerance.
Intolerance, yes, from milk.
Protein. It is a protein.
Can cause inflammation. But there's also a product called lectins, which is in plant foods, and it's the plant's self-defense mechanism. And that product there is a thing that can make a body respond in an inflammatory way when it's consumed. And so those lectins appear in those things called nightshades, which are like tomatoes, eggplants, even some potatoes, legumes. So like your peanuts, lentils, and
I think just food allergies and intolerances in general. Like everyone's going to have different, especially intolerances, which can be very hard to quantify and to realise that you have. I think a lot of people, unless you do an elimination diet or you go and do some IgG testing, which is sort of more beneficial for looking at food intolerances, I think a lot of people are unaware that a food that they're eating, which doesn't really have a massive overt effect when you eat it, but it might have a subtle inflammatory effect. And if you're consuming it a lot,
yeah.
And definitely you touched on like the main ones like your dairy, your grains, potentially your lectins, but a whole bunch of other things. It can really be a bit of a silent assassin where you might be consuming that every day or regularly in your diet, and it's always just giving you that little inflammatory burden that you're not aware of.
Yeah,
so,
and we probably don't eat a lot of these every day in our diet, but things like spinach, rhubarb, soy, almonds, and beets, they're oxalates, and oxalates are things that sort of contribute to stones. So your kidney stones, your gallbladder stones, those sort of things. So things hardening as a result of inflammation. I found that quite interesting. That food and allergies are a big one of inflammation. And I've often thought that red wine, because I suffer sinus, and I'm still yet to identify what causes sinus. I've tried going off dairy. I don't eat grains. I don't eat breads or anything like that. But I still suffer sort of sinuses, chronic sinus issues.
Well, that's a histamine response, isn't it?
Yeah,
to something.
It sure is. Yeah.
I thought red wine might have caused it, because often I'll wake up in the morning, and other people might realise that you have a night on the red wine and you're really sort of blocked up.
Yeah. Well, I think alcohol is a chronic stressor. You know, if you're constantly having alcohol, your liver needs to process that, and it is a toxin, right? Your liver does have to process that. So if I don't know whether it's something that in the red wine that's causing you an issue, but alcohol in general is another one.
But then I read
red
wine is actually reduces inflammation because of the tannin. So tannin is an anti-inflammatory product.
But you talk. I think tannins. Correct me if I'm wrong, someone. But tannins are also a plant defense mechanism.
Okay. Yep.
Like a lectin, so that they can cause some people grief.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean also if you want tannins, you can have black tea and stuff like that. So you don't necessarily have to consume the alcohol component of red wine.
Yeah.
And also with red wine, look at things like the pesticides and the additives that are in the red wine.
That's another one, isn't it?
So you got your
anything,
you got your sulfites in there as well, and a lot of them have the preservative 220 in them. Yeah. So you could play around with looking at like an organic red wine maybe that didn't have any of those sort of pesticides and maybe preservatives in them. A lot of people react to the sulfites in red wine. So
if anyone can find a nice tasting organic red wine that doesn't taste like shit, let me know.
I got one, mate. I'll flick it to you. Yeah. I can't think of the brand off the top of my head, but I can picture the label.
Okay.
It's very good.
Yeah, mate.
There's one that's in a lot of the local ones now, Hero of Zero. And it's got on the label, no 220.
Yeah,
right.
So they're talking about no preservatives, no sulfites in it, and that's at all the major brands now, where you get your liqueur.
Yep.
And it's not super expensive. Some of them are pushing $20-$25 a bottle, but that one's sort of 15.
Yep. Yeah. I think there's one called Farmhand we've gotten a few times, like $13 a bottle maybe for a little bottle of Shiraz or something. So, there's definitely options around. It's getting better every day as people's sort of acceptance and desire for organic stuff seems to be increasing. So,
well, I have noticed when I go into those places to get those, they used to be in their own little section, and now maybe they're that prolific that they're now most places there. You've got to search through all the standard bottles to try and find it.
Gotcha.
So which is a good thing, right? It's now starting to get a little bit mainstream that these things people are knowing now are causing issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So guys, we've covered some really important ones here. So we've spoken about obviously your omega-6s, your cortisol, your glucose, sort of food allergies and intolerances. We touched on vitamin D, sort of leading in from last week's podcast. I've got one that's a little bit, you don't hear it as much in the conversation around inflammation, and that's iron levels. Have you guys come across this?
Yeah.
It's a huge one.
Yep. Too much iron.
Too much iron, and especially in men.
So ancestrally, as a man and people in general, there would have been a lot of scuffles, I reckon.
Yeah, probably bleeding a little bit.
A lot of bleeding,
Yep.
and then sort of your bloodletting a little bit.
Yes.
And then your iron levels go down. So I reckon we don't do that a lot anymore. And one of the good ways to get rid of it is donating blood.
Really good. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
free.
okay.
It's free, yeah.
Some parts of the world they pay you.
Yeah.
Or you can just go out for a night out in Northbridge.
Yeah. Punch on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll cut you off there.
No,
Matty, but
just take up some adrenaline sports, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mountain biking's good for that, I can tell you.
No, that's a good
Yeah,
point,
for sure.
Smitty.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if your iron levels are too high, then you're going to generate hydroxyl free radicals, which are like the most devastating inflammatory molecule in your body. So for people who are supplementing with iron, or if people have hemochromatosis, which is a natural sort of like overload of iron, you really want to make sure that you're giving blood. And if you're supplementing with iron, really make sure you're not getting too much. It's really worthwhile getting tested, because that's going to really prematurely age you. And those hydroxyl free radicals can't really be broken down. They run absolute havoc through your body. Even if you're doing, some people even talk about going as far as if you're cooking with like an iron skillet.
No, cooking was on my list, yeah.
You can, possibly be getting too much iron, because iron is fortified in a lot of foods as well. A lot of cereals and things like that are fortified with iron, and we're all obsessed with having high iron levels. But it's another one of those ones where enough is good, not enough is not good, too much is super, super bad. It's incredibly bad for you.
Yeah.
So if your iron levels are high, please go and give blood.
Yeah.
Because the blood banks need it.
Yep.
And you definitely don't want to be rocking around with too much iron. So don't supplement unless you really need it.
Well, I don't know it off the top of my head, but there are links to excess iron and increases in heart disease.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
So you talked about cooking before, Matty, and I wanted to bring that up with regards to high temperature cooking. So you were talking about using the cooking pan and it leaching iron into your food and it being excess, and a way to get excess iron, and that obviously causes inflammation. But I wanted to talk about sort of the way we cooked our food and using prolonged excessive high temperatures and using vegetable oils and oils that have a high smoke point that are already chemically treated. So our vegetable oils are, you can look it up on the internet. It's horrendous. Look up how canola oil is made. They're using what are already rancid oils, stabilizing it with chemicals and heat treating it so that we can then use it. So that causes sort of oxidative stress and oxidative issues for the body, and then we're sort of using that oil to cook it or cook our food in. It's sort of there's these things called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, the glycotoxins. So they accelerate aging, and they're sort of like a chain reaction between sort of glucose and proteins, and we produce these glycation end products or oxidative stress from sort of a pattern of hyperglycemia or excess glucose in the bloodstream. So we can do that internally, or externally we can do that by prolonged or excessive cooking in these rancid, heat-treated vegetable oils. And they are they're causing sort of cellular damage, promote oxidation and inflammation, and one of the major contributors to accelerated aging. So one way to reduce that is to cook on low temperature, and my buddies that are all low, slow, cooking at 100 degrees Celsius for 8 or 9 hours. That's in their Webers with the charcoal. That's a positive promotion for that, and to reduce sort of really high temperature, or stop us using high temperature chemically treated oils to cook our foods in. That would be another one I would say to get rid of. We've talked about it before, getting rid of those vegetable oils, but getting rid of high cooking temperatures and using those oils in our cooking.
You definitely don't want to be hitting a smoke point, do you? So if you've got a pan and it's smoking, or a barbie and it's smoking up, that's absolutely not going to be your best course of action.
Yep. Not everyone can cook for 8 hours low and slow every day, but there are ways that we can get around that, sort of using butter or tallow or ghee to cook.
Oil.
Coconut oil. Avocado oil is another good one.
Even olive oil.
I think olive oil is
so
not
extra
bad.
virgin olive oil has quite a low smoke point, but if you just use normal olive oil and you're sensible about the heat you put into it, it's not too bad.
Yeah, we don't want to get it too hot.
No.
Yeah.
What about gut health? Surely having affected gut biome is going to cause inflammation.
Definitely.
You got irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers, gastritis. Those things form by poor gut health. I even read somewhere that even just being constipated as a result of poor gut digestion. So constipation, you got blockage. At a blockage, inflammation occurs in your colon. So it pays to pay attention to your gut health as well, and eating all those good foods. And a lot of those conditions I just mentioned there, apparently cabbage is a great fix for, particularly in a sauerkraut form. But cabbage has those properties that can help assist with those inflammations of the gut.
Yes, all your cruciferous type vegetables, super, super good. And like you said, your sauerkrauts, kimchis, the fermented ones, really good.
Yeah, and sauerkraut's just so easy. You can buy it already made at the shop in a jar.
Yeah, I love it. Kimchi.
It's beautiful.
I have kimchi on my eggs in the morning. I have eggs and avocado, and I often put a bit of kimchi or sauerkraut. I bloody love it. It's really nice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Such an easy fix. What do you reckon, Mick?
Yeah, our kids absolutely love the sauerkraut. Absolutely smash it. We go through tubs of it every week. So I think taking in that consideration of your gut health is really, really important as well.
Yeah, any fermented food is going to be good for your gut.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's we could probably do a whole podcast on that one too.
Yeah.
Oh, gut health's a big one, isn't it? That'd be a really good one to sink our teeth into at some stage.
Yeah.
And what about just your chronic infections as well? So generally some infections like your herpes virus, lupus, which is like an immune system attacking joints and skin and blood cells and heart and that sort of thing. Those sort of little infections that are sort of just ticking away there quietly, bubbling away in our body, and then they sort of emerge during times of stress and things like that. They are also a cause of inflammation.
Yeah, they sure are. Yeah.
So I guess the big one is, and one of my next questions would be if we can maybe circle back to that one if we need to, but what can we do to stop these chronic stresses? And like you're talking about there, are they caused by stress? So if there's ways that we can reduce our stress, or are they caused by diet, or are they caused by environment? So those kind of things, what can we do to get rid of these chronic inflammations? And I mean, we didn't even talk about smoking, and maybe that's a given. Like smoking,
like pollutants, environmental pollutants,
environmental toxins. Yeah.
Even if you look at sort of plastics and glyphosate spray and all, there are so many things.
Yeah.
But I guess on the things that we have touched on about, sort of improving diet, reducing our stress, and that would help with those sort of chronic inflammations you're talking about there.
And just don't skim over diet. Just I think what Smitty touched on before about the vitamin D, and we spoke about that in the last podcast.
Vitamin,
that would probably be your number one. What is it? Vitamin D3 and your vitamin K2.
K2, yeah.
Are your best ways taken in a considerable dose.
Yeah.
Because they remove calcium from the blood and joints and send them back into the bones where they're needed, therefore reducing inflammation. Vitamin D again, such an important mineral.
Yeah. But I mean, even if you talked about supplementation, could you talk about sort of glutathione, and they talk about that one being Superman of antioxidants.
Yep.
That's probably something you can touch on at a later later stage, but
Yeah,
or another time.
Like just briefly, I'll touch on the glutathione, and if you want to even go one step further back from glutathione and just get your body to produce more of its own endogenous glutathione, one of the absolute superfoods for reducing inflammation is broccoli seed sprouts, like broccoli sprouts. Yeah. So they contain a compound called sulforaphane, and that is just an absolutely amazing compound for sort of detox and knocking down inflammation.
Wow.
So
hang on, mate. Broccoli what? So how do I get that? Where do I find it?
So essentially, my wife and I have done this. We've been taking sulforaphane or broccoli sprouts on and off for a while. So what we did is we sent away to an organic seed store, and they sent us some broccoli seed sprouts.
Yeah.
It was very inexpensive. It was, say, about $12 Australian for a giant bag, which would have made us a year's supply of broccoli sprouts. And you can sprout them on your kitchen bench. And essentially, they look like an alfalfa sprout or any sort of sprout that you would eat. Okay. So you put these little seeds on either some cotton wool that's moist or a tray, and you keep them wet for a few days, and they grow, and then you eat them. But they're very high in this compound that's sort of found in cruciferous vegetables called sulforaphane, and it's an absolutely superstar sort of molecule of improving detoxification and reducing inflammation.
Wow.
And what it does is it stimulates something called your NRF2 pathway, which is a genetic pathway that we can stimulate, and it'll massively upregulate your endogenous, so your natural body's production of things like glutathione and your sort of anti-inflammatory compounds. So if you want an inexpensive, non-pharmaceutical way of really supercharging your immune system, knocking down your inflammation, broccoli sprouts. You can actually buy supplements with sulforaphane in them, but they're quite expensive. Make them yourself. Sprouts and broccoli sprouts. Other sprouts are good as well, natural, but particularly broccoli seed sprouts.
Yep.
And in terms of another really good supplement, which is a bit of a superstar in the wellness world now, is molecular hydrogen. I don't know if you guys have come across molecular hydrogen tablets. Again, molecular hydrogen, absolutely amazing at sort of balancing the redox pathways in your body, so reduction oxidization. So that's the two sides of the seesaw, if you will. So we've got reduction and oxidization. The two are supposed to balance each other out. And
biochemistry here.
Yeah, look,
nice.
Molecular hydrogen is absolutely amazing because it'll, unlike a pure antioxidant like vitamin C, molecular hydrogen will just find that perfect balance, but it won't tip you over the scale because you can take too much vitamin C and have too many effects that way. You don't want to. You don't want to knock off. You don't want to take too much vitamin C. So molecular hydrogen is a little bit expensive, but that also stimulates our NRF2 pathway and has absolutely amazing health benefits. The one downside is it is costly. I think it's the absolute best thing out there you could take for wellness if you were really serious and you didn't mind spending a bit of money.
And so you mentioned vitamin C. That's also a good anti-inflammatory.
It's an antioxidant, so it'll help with sort of balancing out that inflammation in your body and things like that. But
I've found that I take spirulina and chlorella supplementations, and I've found that since I've been on those, I've reckoned about 5 or 6 years, I've never had a flu. I mean, I got COVID, but other than that, I don't reckon I've ever had it. I put it down to those.
Are they more for a detox? I thought they're good
an
for binding to toxins to get rid of them from your body.
They are. Yeah. Well, they're an
I guess
antioxidant.
If you're getting rid of toxins, then you're reducing your inflammation, aren't you? So
exactly. Detox and controlling inflammation is sort of go hand in hand, don't they? Like I think there's definitely a chat for us in like methods for detox.
Yeah.
But it really is a hand-in-hand thing. If you're reducing your detox, like you say, Roo, you're going to reduce that inflammatory burden. So
yeah. And what about, we had a full episode on it in previous podcasts, is fasting.
Yeah.
Just the benefits of fasting for inflammation. Regular intermittent fasting and also prolonged fasting.
Yeah.
Fasting, I read somewhere, it reduces chronic inflammation by turning off certain genes that are related. You mentioned genes before, mate, that are related to inflammation. It turns those off when you're fasting. It increases your antioxidant production and decreases stress of your adrenal glands. So some fasting on a regular basis can be an excellent way to decrease your
it just gives your body something else to do rather than to always be processing food.
And it gives your body a reset.
Yeah, it gives you a chance to stop having to do something, focus on fixing things.
And once again, it's free.
It's free.
Yeah.
We haven't even talked about sleep either and how sleep can reduce inflammation or increase it, depending on how you look at it. But that's another one.
Interesting topic.
Definitely sleep. We'll definitely dive into that one, I think.
Yeah. I'd love to, man, because my sleep's been suffering at the moment. I was just really struggling. I don't know whether it's just getting older or having to wake up 2 or 3 times to go to the toilet. That's another issue.
Prostate health coming up.
Yeah. Or just too much shit going through my brain. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I've got so much stuff in my head and I can't go back to sleep. I don't know. My sleep is an issue at the moment. I've even resorted to taking some melatonin randomly. I don't want to take too much of it because obviously, being a hormone, you start supplementing with hormones, your body stops producing it naturally. But to be honest, the melatonin has worked massively.
Melatonin is really good anti-inflammatory.
It is.
As well,
Yeah,
so
I read that too.
very, very, very effective.
But I'm just really cautious of taking too much of it.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
You know what? I tried it. I wonder if it's a bit like it kind of. I feel like it has the opposite effect on me. Melatonin
Oh.
keeps me up. I don't know.
Well, maybe you should do a line of coke before you go to bed.
Maybe.
Yeah.
maybe I'm like
Have 10 glasses
maybe
of
I'm
coffee.
ADD
and
and I
you're
have,
passed out. You go to sleep.
You know, like how a Dexy. If you take a Dexy and you're ADD, it keeps you level, and if you're not, then it.
Yeah, the opposite.
You've got sleep ADD.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that's
Anyway,
another topic, I guess. Just moving away from information, but
Just out of curiosity, have any of you guys ever tested your inflammation levels? I reckon you would have, CJ.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we did talk about things we could test for in the last episode, and C-reactive protein is a marker of inflammation. So that if you can explain that to your doctor and the reasons why you want to take it.
yeah, right.
Yeah, so I get mine tested, and if I think above 1 is bad.
Yeah.
I don't know what the reference range is, but I mean, as in, I don't know what the number means. It's a marker of your C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation.
But sorry, mate. That can't identify where that inflammation is originating from. It's just a generic
So even
inflammation marker.
if you crook, so if I got my blood tested at the time and I had a cold or COVID, I would say it would be higher.
Oh, massively higher.
Yeah.
I had a family member who had got quite a serious bacterial infection. They measured C-reactive protein. It was up at like 80.
Yeah.
And I think, like you say, you were sort of aiming for maybe less than 1, but a lot of people in the wellness world would want it to be less than 0.5.
Yeah,
right.
So even if you had a sore back or something like that, that might be that might push it up.
Gotcha.
But that's a good way to test it.
Really cheap to test as well. Again, it's a bit like vitamin D. If you're going to go and get your vitamin D tested, chuck in C-reactive protein.
Yeah.
Costs almost nothing.
Mm.
Go for the high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's a much more accurate test.
They're more reluctant. Doctors are more reluctant to give you that one.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I think it costs $1 extra if you pay for it yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the Medicare subsidised one is maybe there's some difference there in their billing code or something. Yeah.
I'd really like to maybe discuss in another podcast the things that we can test for.
That would be a great podcast.
Because, I mean, you're always having a chat to people and they go, I reckon every 6 months you should go and get everything tested to see where my body's at.
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Bring your wallet.
Yeah.
But I can bring in mine and show you the ones that you can get for free.
Yeah,
You just go in and ask your doctor.
Yeah.
I think all I said was I've changed my dietary habits and I just wanted to see if these things had affected it. And if you can explain the reasons why you want certain ones, then it's all good.
Might even be providing your GP with a little bit of education himself, mate.
Possibly,
A lot of them wouldn't even understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that would be a good one to talk about. And I've gone down a different route to you, CJ. I've paid for my own testing through some private providers. It was it was expensive. It was sort of a couple of $100, but it allowed me to get everything that I wanted. I didn't have to go and sort of speak to a doctor. And I guess by the time you pay for a doctor's consult, sometimes that can even some of that out if you don't have a bulk billing doctor. But I reckon that'd be a really good topic.
What did you get tested, mate, if you don't mind?
A whole range of things. I had 10 or 12 different things, but definitely vitamin D was on there. I tested 2 different types of vitamin D, so 125 and 25OH, which are 2 different types of vitamin D. And I definitely tested the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, insulin-like growth factor, lipoprotein A, all my cholesterols, some of my hormones, liver health, kidney health. There was a range of other ones on there as well. So I wanted to do a reasonably big screen But yeah, it'd be good to talk about that.
This would be a great discussion. I'd really like to get into that.
So I guess getting sort of towards the end of the podcast, is there anything else you guys wanted to talk about? I think we got the main systematic inflammation causes and things that we can do to mitigate against those. I don't know,
Well, quite a topical one. Hearing a lot in the news about pericarditis and myocarditis. Two conditions I've never even heard about. Pericarditis being inflammation of the sac that envelops your heart, and myocarditis being inflammation of the heart muscle itself.
I'll just tell you briefly, Roo. I was a paramedic on the road in Perth for about 7 years, and didn't really see any of it. Wasn't a thing.
I've heard
seems to be extremely prevalent now.
I've heard many paramedics say the same thing, mate.
So look, whether it's COVID or something else, who knows? But there certainly seems to be an increase in it. Maybe it's something we're taking for COVID.
Well, I won't be shy in saying, mate, it's a vaccine side effect, really. My mum got pericarditis, and she is an older woman who's sort of a bit more trusting in the medical profession and whatever, but she swears that it was her getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
Nothing to see here.
Well, I mean, spike protein is incredibly pro-inflammatory.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And those damages, those inflammations to your heart, they stay around a long time, don't they? That myocarditis, that's a long-term thing.
It can be, yeah. It depends on the severity and a few other things, but yeah, it definitely can cause long-lasting damage.
Yeah. And a lot of people that suffer it have to go on medication.
Possibly, yeah.
And reduce their exercise levels. So yeah, maybe another contributing factor to inflammation could be drugs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even prescription drugs that are supposed to help us can cause inflammation somewhere else.
Most definitely, yep. I think what we've touched on today is live a clean life, get back to nature, get your vitamin D levels up, get out in the sun, eat good food, exercise,
sleep a bit more. Yeah, and we can. I've made a note of a few follow-up podcasts we can do, but sleep was definitely one of them.
Yeah,
I think Mickey Mack, he touched on it too. Just listen to your body. Just listen to your body and just think maybe it could be some inflammation causing this problem that I've got. There's stiffness in the hip, there's clicking here, there's sort of arthritic pain in my fingers on my knees. Just think about it. Maybe it's an inflammation thing, but what can I do to reduce my inflammation levels?
Yep. And you don't have to tackle it all at once. You don't have to do every single thing we've listed today. Just choose one thing if it's a bit daunting. Just choose whatever you think is most appropriate for you and go from there. You might notice some really good change.
Way to finish up. Mickey, you got anything else you want to pop in there?
No, I think we've covered it all off, guys. And I think just an important note, though, in finishing is to remind people that at the point that you're getting chronic inflammation, you've potentially been developing it for quite a long time. So even if you do make one or a couple of these changes, a lot of the time it won't just be a quick fix. It isn't going to be something that, reverses itself in a matter of days. You might need to commit to the process of regaining your health for equally as long as what you have taking it into negative health. So,
that's right,
just be patient and know that, as we've said on many occasions, the things you're doing here, not that we're doctors as we continually say, but they are good for you, and it's likely they will have some form of positive impact on your health.
Good point, mate. Good point.
Great way to finish, I think.
Just have a crack.
Yep.
Yeah, good chat, fellas. Important topic.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Hey, well, I reckon we've got to do a podcast with a couple of frothies. Just, just update the inflammation in the gut.
It's all about balance, isn't it? It might knock off a bit of stress, so maybe we'll have a net.
But we've knocked off a few serious episodes here.
Yeah.
Starting with the mental health and all that. The president one was bit of fun. Maybe we just get together and chat about something a little bit off the cuff, maybe, have a couple of beers and enjoy each other's company over that. Not that I don't enjoy your company without beers.
Good. Yeah. It does take a couple of beers to enjoy our company. That's what you're saying.
Well, I've got a few nice gluten-free beers coming across from a nice brewery over in Victoria.
Nice.
So,
Excellent.
Give them a plug. Maybe we can get them to sponsor us, mate.
Two Bays Brewery. I love their work. They've just released a lovely sounding almond milk porter.
Oh.
gluten free.
There you go.
Will you bring the beers, mate? And I'll bring the organic wine.
Right on. Let's do it. Okay, lads. Until then.
All right. Until next time.
See you, boys.
See you guys.
See you guys.